Hello, everyone. This is Frank Yanis, host of Smarter Food Safety, where we ask the tough questions and seek real answers on some of the most important food safety issues of our day. Thank you for joining us. This week, we're going to have a timely, maybe even more importantly, a needed discussion titled Rethinking Food Safety. What will it take to finally bend the curve of foodborne illnesses in our country? Something that the data suggests we haven't been able to do for more than 20 years. Despite all of the efforts, all of the activities, all of the money spent, and all the work being done in our profession. Get ready for a no-nonsense, no-spin conversation with Dr. Martin Wiedmann from Cornell University. He's a well-known researcher, a teacher, and has in-depth and breadth of real-world experience in outreach, extension, and crisis management situations. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss his insights and perspective. The Smarter Food Safety Podcast is sponsored by Ecolab, a trusted partner throughout my career. They're dedicated to protecting what's vital by advancing food safety, ensuring clean and safe environments, and enhancing water quality around the world. Well, hey, Martin, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining our podcast titled Smarter Food Safety. What a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be. I think I'm third one, right? So that's a big honor. Thanks for that.
You're right, Martin, early on. And, we built this podcast as a conversation, willing to ask the hard questions and get real answers to what we call some of the biggest food safety issues of our day. And it is early on. We've been thinking about what are the types of topics we wanted to present. And one of them was something that's near and dear to me, and I think to you as well. It's called Rethinking. Yes, that's right. Rethinking food safety. What do we have to do to finally bend the curve of foodborne illness in our country? And Martin, not to flatter you, as I thought about, well, goodness, that's a pretty broad topic. There's a lot we could say. Who should we invite? Your name came immediately to the top of my list. And I said, I'd like to speak to Martin because having worked with you for many, many years, both while I was in the public and private sector, I know that you give science-based answers and you kind of give it in an unvarnished way. So our listeners are in for a treat today, hearing just the truth of what you think about food safety. Martin, we've worked a long time together. I think a lot of people will know who you are, but I always like to start off just allowing our guests to give a little bit about your background. I know you're a researcher, you're an author, you're a teacher, you work in the public and private sector, you've helped agencies, in foodborne outbreak investigations, and you help companies. But why don't you describe to the listeners a little bit about what you do?
So I'm actually a veterinarian by training. Fun fact. So I got my veterinary degree from the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, Germany, and then subsequently got a PhD in food science and food safety from Cornell University. And I've been running a research team since 1999. And now a team really looks at how microbes are transmitted from primary production, so that's farms, irrigation water even, all the way to humans. And when we say microbes, we look at both pathogens predominantly, but also at foodborne spoilage organisms. And then we look at how do we take that knowledge we gain in terms of transmission to reduce foodborne illness and reduce food spoilage. So we both a foundational research lab, but also an applied research lab. And I actually have an extension appointment to help with that translation of our findings in trying to reduce foodborne illness.
That's great. Thanks, Martin. And I don't know if you realize how much the work that you've done over the years has touched others. I think I've shared with you one of my first memories, Martin, was when I was at the world's largest retailer. And you published a study that really scared the daylights out of me that said, hey, we find listeria in terms of kind of resident listeria in retail delis hanging around for a long period of time. And if I recall correctly, you'll know the percentage. I think it was 34% of the retail delis that you surveyed. And for me, that just shocked me. And at that time, and that was a long time ago, I think it was the year 2010, we decided at that retailer, it said, we're going to do everything we can to prevent listeria from getting into food. But it might be prudent to ask our suppliers to reformulate their deli meats with the listeria inhibitor. So that's the type of effect that I know you've had on kind of the world's largest retailer, on me and another brand. So the work that you do matters, and it makes a difference. Martin, we've titled today, what will it take to bend the curve of foodborne illness? And I'll provide the readers with a little bit of a setup. We want to hear more from you than Frank Yanis. But, when I think about what's happened in the field of food safety over the course of my career, I think, well, lately, Martin, there's almost a daily or weekly drumbeat of recalls, right? There's a lot of recalls. It's hard to keep up with them, even for fellows like you and I that have to pay attention to these things. At the same time, it's been disappointing to see surveys that say consumer trust in food safety and the federal government's ability to ensure food safety, as well as the private sector, is at all-time lows. Credible surveys done by Gallup and others. And at the same time, I think I love this quote from Edward Deming, who says, "In God we trust, all others bring data." If you look at the incidence of foodborne disease over the past 25 years through FoodNet data, the incidence of certain pathogens per 100,000 U.S. population, those illness rates, better than I, haven't changed much in 20, 25 years. If you look at the incidence rate of Salmonella, 1999, it's not too far off today. If you look at Campylobacter, Listeria. And so I know it's a provocative question, but it's one of my favorite questions to ask. I generally ask, are we winning the battle against foodborne disease? But I'll frame it a little bit differently for you. Martin, when you see FoodNet trends for over 20 years remaining fairly flat, how do you react to that? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's a good question. It's I think one of the most important questions we need to ask ourselves. So first, maybe to add a little bit more nuance, and I think it's important as we answer that question, is the FoodNet data really, reported illnesses through active surveillance. That doesn't really mean true incidence, because one of the challenges we have foodborne illnesses is, if it's the mild foodborne illness, is probably around only 1 out of 30 people goes to the doctor and even has a chance to be reported. So the reporting system itself plays into it too. But here's I think there are the reasons that you typically hear, and I think all of them contribute to it, but then I come to what I think the real reason is. So the reasons they contribute is a little bit better surveillance, whole genome sequencing. That might help us detect some more outbreaks. So while the true incidence is going down, we might detect some more outbreaks. Big factor? Probably not. Increasing elderly population, increasing population that's susceptible to listeriosis. So again, food safety, we've done pretty well, is the argument, but more people are highly susceptible. Maybe plays into it. Is that what's driving that? We're not bending the curve. No, I think there are bigger reasons. And then you get to all the other things, like the food systems are getting more complex, climate change, and the litany goes on and on. But I think all of them may or may not contribute, but I think the big issue is that we've been addressing food safety the same way as we have 30 years ago now, which is largely hazard-based. That means we find listeria somewhere, and that's got to be a problem. We have not truly transitioned to risk-based food safety. And that means we're putting the resources in the wrong places in many cases. I think we're going to have more of a discussion to dig into that deeper, but that's, to me, is that we need to conceptually and deeply change how we address foodborne illness. And the idea is zero risk is what we're aiming for, and it's a good stretch goal. It's just not cutting it anymore. It's not going to make us any better.
Right. Zero risk, I agree with you, Martin, is philosophically the right thing, right? And I've said this, publicly, one foodborne illness in my mind is one too many, but is it achievable across all commodities? Maybe not, but we should continue to try to drive to zero. I love your response, and I'm glad you didn't use WGS as a crutch, because when I look at that incidence of foodborne disease, granted, it's aggressive versus passive surveillance. I look at, when did we introduce pulse field gel electrophoresis? When did we introduce whole genome sequence? When did we start moving towards culture-independent tests? And I don't see significant fluctuations there. And so I think a lot of people, Martin, tend to use that as a crutch, but I'm glad you're saying, hey, maybe we have to think about what we're doing and change our approach. Because if you think about it, for 30 years, we've been trying a lot of the same approaches. We've been training, we've been testing, we have FSMA for, many years now. The nation has been spending, Martin, around $2.8 billion between FDA and FSIS on food safety. The industry has stepped up with GFSI-based audits, and we're not affecting these outcomes. And you know what the definition of insanity is, right?
Doing the same thing over and over again. Yeah.
And expecting different results. So let's pivot to what are the types of things we think we need to rethink. I think that's a good word is what should we be rethinking? Giannis thinks there's a lot of things we need to rethink. Some of it informed and shaped by some of your great work. I think we need to rethink how we identify hazards and evaluate food safety risks. I think we need to implement better food safety controls. I think we need to, rethink environmental monitoring. Again, I've heard you speak about that and that has informed and shaped my thinking. I think we need to rethink whether we need two federal agencies or a single food safety agency. We could go on and on and on. But when I ask that question, and we'll go a little bit deeper, what are some of the top things that come to mind that you think we need to rethink? And we'll go into more depth in them.
So let me first add a comment to the WGS. I think WGS detects more outbreaks. It doesn't detect more illness cases. I think that's important there. But okay, what needs to change? What are some of the big issues? And I'm going to start with, to me, the foundational one, risk versus hazard. We've talked about risk-based for a long, long time, right? But I think we have not approached it correctly. I think conceptually, a lot of people have just, essentially hit the find and replace button on their computer and replaced hazard with risk, which is not what a risk is, right? A hazard is an inherent property like listeria monocytogenes. Risk is a probability. How likely are we to see a negative effect? And we've said, environmental monitoring programs, anything, it needs to be risk-based. But we have this huge chasm between what risk-based means. There's on the one hand, and you've been part of these massive government or academic risk assessments where 10 people spend a year to do a risk assessment to focus on something very small that helps somewhat with decision making, but doesn't get at the practical risk-based decision making. And then on the other hand, we have the people that, as I said, they just replace hazard with risk. And we have failed to communicate what risk-based really means. I think there's a perception, I think in government and some of the other organizations, that risk-based is either, academics just being academics, trying to get more funding to do complicated shit. And on the other hand, it's industry trying to get away with it. Getting away with, it's risk-based, we can't spend money fixing this because it's a low risk, etc. And neither is true. But I think we need to change that narrative. I think we need to change it with simple examples, not just what risk-based is, but why hazard-based thinking prevents us from improving food safety. And if you indulge me for a minute, I'm going to give you an example.
Sure.
And this relates to environmental monitoring. So to me, risk classic hazard-based thinking is I have a listeria positive on a loading dock, and I have a listeria positive above a conveyor belt with exposed product. Hazard-based, we got to fix both of them. They're both presence of hazard, and I don't differentiate where I find it, okay? And if I have $40,000 to spend, I'm going to spend $20,000 fixing the loading dock and $20,000 fixing the issue that gets me to the positive above my exposed food. Now, everyone says, Martin, that's ridiculous. No one would do that. Okay, I give you that. But now let's take it more nuanced. We have a positive on the loading dock for listeria. We have an exposed food on a conveyor belt, and above it is condensation. We tested it once or twice or every week, and it's negative. We're going to put our money into fixing the loading dock in most cases, not the condensation above the exposed food. A lot of people probably will agree with me that the bigger risk is not your listeria positive in the loading dock. It's the non-listeria positive, but the structural problem I have above my exposed product. But FDA, USDA, when they're going to come in, they're going to go much harder in most cases on that listeria positive in the loading dock than where the true risk lies. Now, let's take it even further. We have that listeria positive in the loading dock, and we get in foreign materials, we get ingredients in there. The ingredients are perfect. All the COAs say negative for listeria, negative for salmonella. So no evidence of presence of a hazard, but I have a hazard on my loading dock. Where am I going to put my money? Am I going to tell my QA people, don't do much stuff on that listeria in the loading dock. Not so important. Focus on your 400 foreign suppliers that bring in all these ingredients from facilities you've never been at. You have no visibility to it, and you don't know what's going on. No, we don't do that. And then we have where we are right now. We have outbreaks linked with ingredients. There's this and that because we're focusing on the obvious hazards, but forget to think about risks. And
Yeah,
the regulators do it, industry does it, academia does it. And that is one of the reasons why we're not doing better.
that's great. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is a great place to start. Rethinking food safety, we have to rethink how we're doing hazard analysis and risk assessments. And Martin, I think, you know, part of it is just historical framework, right? What did we base our risk management models on? HACCP. And while I'm a big fan of HACCP, what does HACCP talk about? Hazards, not risks. And so I sometimes argue that, hey, we can't use the same risk management framework, teach it the same way for 50 years. It has to evolve. And what you're talking about is an evolution of how we think about hazards and risks. I hope we teach the next generation. And we've seen outbreaks, Martin. If you think about the Wanabana outbreak, applesauce, flavored with cinnamon, if you looked at their food safety plan, it's in the public record. They didn't identify lead as a hazard and risk. And, if I'd be so controversial, I would say even what we're seeing now in current times, we're seeing the infant formula outbreak associated with Clostridium botulinum. And what did we hear public officials say? Well, we're going to have to go test to see if Clostridium botulinum is a hazard. And I don't know about you, I'll put you on the spot here. I personally think we don't need a 3-year survey for that. It's a hazard in powdered infant formula. It's been seen before. The question is, what level of risk does it prevent? And risk is a concept of severity and probability. It is a hazard. It's probably a low probability, moderately severe event. And to your point, now this is the question the industry has to grapple with. What do we do about it?
Right, right. I think, yeah, I agree with you. We had gaps in hazard identification and hazard analysis, right? But I think very often it's the risk assessment part that is the problem and where we're just falling short. And we don't have those. And I just came from the SKF conference, and everything's supposed to be risk-based, but these people have to make 5 risk-based decisions a day. How do you do 5 risk assessments a day? We're giving them zero guidance.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
part of the problem. We need to help people make practical risk-based decisions where it's not like a 6 months risk assessment.
Right. Okay, great. First concept that we need to rethink is really refine and evolve our thinking on hazards and risks. Love it. Hey, another concept I think we need to rethink, and in particular, I want the viewers to hear from you because I sincerely can't think of a better person to talk about it. And this is environmental monitoring, Martin. We've seen lots of outbreaks in the recent past due to recontamination of foods. Some and many that have received some type of post or some type of lethality treatment. We think about listeria contaminating, for example, cooked meals, cooked pasta with meat products in them, and consumers not reheating them properly. I can think about Cronobacter and powdered infant formula, recontamination and environmental monitoring. And you, one time in a meeting I was in, really left an impression on me, which said, Giannis, it's not just about environmental monitoring, it's about environmental control. That's a phrase you use that has stuck with me. And it got me thinking, Martin, I feel like while it was well intended, maybe the seek and destroy mindset has misled some. It was well intended, and I had adopted it for a long time. But I'm now persuaded, having learned and worked with fellows like you, that maybe the mindset is that we're going to seek, let's try our best to find it, right? Because you and I have been in plants when we say, you swab, how many swabs and you've never found it? Let's find it. Then let's understand how it's there, and then let's eliminate it. And often that's through sanitary design. But here's a 2-part question. Do you think the seek and destroy mindset is maybe a little bit too narrowly framed? And number 2, what would you tell the audience they need to do in terms of thinking about shifting from environmental monitoring to environmental control?
Good question, great topic. And I think, as you said, one important to bend the curve. Now, let's start with sort of, I think, a little bit the basics. And you brought up is HACCP. I think, what I think we forget, some people forget, in HACCP is their prerequisite programs. And I think we've neglected the prerequisite programs, and the prerequisite is having your environment under control. It starts with, cleaning and sanitation, GMPs, sanitary equipment design, etc. And to me, and maybe you get defensive, maybe not, it's one of the failures of FSMA has been that one of the good things about FSMA has been that we sort of elevated prerequisite programs, non-process preventive controls. One of the failures has been that we did not require validation of prerequisite programs, while we have to validate our process preventive controls. I think we need to move towards validating and verifying those prerequisite programs, because if you look at foodborne illness outbreaks, very, very rarely is it a failure of the critical control point. Almost always it's a failure on the prerequisite programs. And as you mentioned, it's environmental cross-contamination. So first off, we need to really change that. And I've been thinking sometimes about just flipping the hazard pyramid on its top. That we need to go back to saying what's really is first we need to have these prerequisite. HACCP is the foundation right now. The prerequisite programs is what need to be changed, because everyone has HACCP, but I don't think people have the prerequisite programs under control. So change number one is we need to validate and verify our prerequisite programs. Testing and collection of environmental samples is critical in that. And seek and destroy. So that's what people need to do. Validate and verify your prerequisite programs and separate those two out. Now, seek and destroy, in my mind, is misunderstood so many different ways. And I think the current thought process of a lot of people out there, seek and destroy is sort of, okay, I got to collect a bunch of samples, I find listeria and destroy the listeria. There's a bunch of things wrong with that. Number one is destroying the listeria is not going to cut it. You actually need to destroy the niche, the location where it can survive. And I think a lot of people are still trying to destroy listeria, which means that if I find a positive, I pour a bunch of sanitizer on it, 1,600 ppm, and kill the listeria. And then, 4 weeks later, another listeria comes back and occupies the same niche. You need to destroy the niche. Now, when you look back to John Butts and some of his early description of seek and destroy, and I have some slides on that, what he was actually talking about was validation of cleaning and sanitation. The original true SOPs and flowcharts for it talk about, you have a piece of equipment, you take it apart, you clean and sanitize with your standard SOP, you take it apart, you swab, you completely rip it apart to see where you find bacterial counts, maybe listeria, where you find residual soil or dirt, essentially, and then change your SSOP, redesign your equipment in order to validate this cleaning and sanitation. And that's what he called the seek and destroy investigations.
Got it.
And I talked to John about is that, hey, John, I think this is validation. You just gave it a different name and a catchy name by that. And he sort of agreed. I don't want to, cite him incorrectly. But I think seek and destroy, when done correctly, is actually validation of your cleaning and sanitation. When done by just looking at the two words and saying, all right, seek and destroy, let's find listeria and destroy it, then it is completely counterproductive because it's reactive. It's honestly food safety at its worst. So we're just out there as food safety professionals finding problems and not really fixing the root causes. So as said, seek and I'm not going to throw it under the bus. I think if done right, it is absolutely the right thing to do. I think the name was supposed its biggest advantage because it's catchy, but its biggest disadvantage because it's misinterpreted.
Got it. Yeah, that's valid. I appreciate your clarification. And so I love that you're saying, hey, let's not forget validation was always one of the foundational steps of HACCP, and people skip over the validation and go straight to verification. We're hoping they're not forgetting validations when they're designing controls for food, but you're saying, I think they forget that validation is a component when designing how I'm going to clean and sanitize equipment. So let's not forget that.
Who has a true validation of their sanitation? If I go in a plant and say, show me how you validated that this procedure you're using actually clearly and completely sanitizes your piece of equipment. Very often the answers you get is, oh, our chemical supplier has documentation that 400 ppm quad kills listeria. Well, that doesn't tell me it's working. It doesn't tell me the sanitizer reaches the spot it needs to reach. And that's what the usual problem is. It's not that the sanitizer doesn't kill listeria. It doesn't get there.
Right.
And that's what needs to be fixed. And so we need to validate those specific protocols we use that they can truly fully eliminate listeria with a sanitation step. And I think it's happening more, but it's still happening rarely. Yeah.
That's what's missing. Yeah. And I appreciate the clarification on seek and destroy, that it was always the intention for it to be thorough, but sometimes people have misapplied it. So if it's a catchy phrase, it helps you remember it. Just remember, it's not about just pouring a lot of sanitizer and coming up with some negatives temporarily, only to find out you had the same problem a couple of weeks later. Hey, let's pivot to another thing, is just listeria. And I have to ask this one, Martin, because you've done so much work on listeria over the years. I mean, you've been one of the main researchers that's put out studies on listeria and where can it be found. When I pause to think about listeria, we've seen a lot of outbreaks and recalls. In fact, if you look at recalls over the past 2 years, people can debate whether they're up or down. I think a lot of the most current interpretation is this year we're seeing recalls up, and we're seeing the units of food products actually up. If you look, people often say, well, it's mainly recalls, but when you look at the bacterial agents, listeria is number one. One of the main reasons why we have recalls due to bacterial contamination of food, it's listeria. Martin, I'm also looking at the future. I was talking to Dr. Mindy Brashears, and I said, Mindy, do you know, I'm a baby boomer. Do you know by the year 2030, all baby boomers that are alive are going to be 65 years or older? That's not too far away, and we make a pretty large percentage of the population. You mentioned at the beginning at-risk consumers. It's great that people are living with underlying medical conditions because of the marvels of modern science. But we've got to do something. When you think about listeria, what is it that we have to do differently to bend the curve of listeriosis? Or else I think the incidence rates aren't going to change much unless we do something different. In fact, with the increased elderly population, they could go up.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think, honestly, with the increasing elderly population, flat means a win, that we made the food safer. It's just the consumers are more susceptible. So I think, yeah, we need to change something. I think first and foremost, because the vast majority of listeriosis, both recalls and outbreaks, are contamination from the environment of, I'm going to call it a food facility. So it could be the processing plant, it could be a packing house,
Sure.
it could be, retail delis, etc. And it's back to that, validation and verification of your prerequisite programs, with a particular emphasis on cleaning and sanitation, but then also other things, sanitary equipment design, preventive maintenance, etc. And then, so the problem with listeria is it's a common organism, right? And we've done studies that we found Listeria monocytogenes, not Listeria species. Listeria monocytogenes in about 8% of samples when we collected samples across the U.S. outside food facilities, actually in national and state parks and protected areas. So it's a common organism, it's going to get in. So that whole hazard versus risk-based becomes a problem. You're going to find Listeria on that sort of proverbial loading dock. If you focus too much resources there, trying to eliminate that versus focusing on how do you really reduce the risk, we're not going to put the resources where we need to put them. So what is all the real, risk reduction strategies? I think one of them is formulating foods and assuring distribution where listeria doesn't grow. It's one of those things, again, you and I know that, and a lot of people know it, but a lot of people also don't know it. Listeria needs very, very high dose in general to make a person sick. So that typically almost always means it needs to grow somewhere. Even in products where we think, well, how does it grow in ice cream? Then we have, outbreaks linked to ice cream. Most likely there was a step in there somewhere where it grew, whether it's making a milkshake that was then stored at a temperature where it could grow or not. So implementing those strategies that reduce listeria growth, if we get it there, which we will, with how common it is, make sure it doesn't grow to levels where it's likely to cause human disease. Is it zero risk? No, but the risk is we're talking 1 in millions of risk, or 1 in 10, 100 or more millions if we reduce growth. So I think that's going to be one important one. And I do think we need to rethink the regulatory and approaches to that, and the enforcement approaches to listeria. The regulatory is like, you have a recall if you have a listeria positive. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 10 million listeria. Well, that's not really risk-based. That's hazard-based, right? And therefore, if people say, well, I could reformulate my food to reduce listeria growth, but it isn't going to reduce my risk of a randomly collected sample testing positive, all right?
Yeah.
If I have 1 in 25 grams, it will test positive. So the incentives, FDA, USDA did actually a good job, FSIS, with some of their, category 1, 2, 3, the details to encourage some of those behavior to really reduce and attack the riskiest products, the ones that support growth. I think FDA needs to get on the bandwagon with that and think about how can we encourage those approaches more. So I think that's a really important one. I'm not a big fan of, I'm going to call it blaming the consumers. It's like, well, the consumers
Right.
just need to do a better job. They need to reheat their deli
I
meats. Not a
agree.
fan of that. But I'm also saying, some consumer education, particularly for the high-risk groups, it's got to be part of the bigger picture. But it's lower down on my list of
Right.
priorities. But, validation and verification of prerequisite programs, truly risk-based approaches to listeria, and focusing on preventing growth. I think something that's sometimes it's so foundational that people consider it trivial, but it's temperature control. I think people forget that with listeria, whether your food's stored at 40 or 46 makes a big difference. Listeria grows faster at 46, that food becomes more risky, and to really continue to crack down on temperature control. And what we've learned with all the new tools available is when you do continuous temperature monitoring, it's like, well, that truck looked like it always had a certain temperature. But when you really measure at different spots within the distribution system, all of a sudden it's like, well, that side of the truck really goes up to 50 degrees,
Yeah.
maybe for a day or so when you do transport, or that part of the cooler goes up. It all depends on some of the nuances. And I think it doesn't have to be your whole, 10,000 packages that are exposed to high temperature. If it's 5 or 6 or 10 that are at the wrong location and they are exposed to higher temperature and allow growth, and you do it over massive volumes of product, that represents high risk. So I do think we need to revisit some of the temperature control along the whole supply chain to help us with listeria control.
Thanks. A lot to unpack there, and it's somewhat related to the earlier conversation we had about environmental monitoring and environmental control. So some good tips, thanks, Martin, on enhancing how we manage listeria. I think a conversation with you in particular and a conversation about rethinking food safety would be incomplete if we didn't talk about whole genome sequencing. And I don't know how you feel, Martin. I know you've done a lot of work in this area. One of my favorite questions to ask classes is, what do you think has been the single one thing that has advanced food safety the most into the 21st century? I don't know what your answer would be, but I generally answer, I used to answer pulse field gel electrophoresis, and now I say it's whole genome sequencing. I don't answer it's FSMA. While, I'm very respectful of HACCP and HACCP principles, they've been really critical to advancing the safety of our food supply. I think it's just our ability to detect foodborne illnesses. I don't know if anybody's ever asked you that question, but what do you think has been the number one thing that has advanced food safety into the 21st century?
So I agree with you, but I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective on why. So I agree with that whole genome sequencing and subtyping has had tremendous impact on food safety. I think sometimes we focus on outbreak detection. That's important. But what it really has done for us is not just it detects more outbreaks, it detects them faster, but it detects food vehicles now that we never thought were an issue because we can detect smaller outbreaks. And now we say, well, we thought it was always, the deli meats and, for listeria and the chicken, the raw undercooked chicken for salmonella and this. And now we're starting to detect, moringa leaves imported
Novel
Chinese people, which
vehicles.
we probably wouldn't have detected. We find out it's persistence of listeria on the harvester in produce. So it's not just different vehicles, different sources that we can trace back, different transmission pathways that we all should translate into now increased prevention. So it's not, to me, it's better understanding what causes foodborne illness, because one of the problems in the past and still today is that a lot of prevention focuses on foods and practices that cause outbreaks. That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
We need to prevent all of them. And I think whole genome sequencing has gotten us closer to that with some of the knowledge we gain from it and some of the examples I provided. Now, It's also given us, as I said, very tremendous in understanding of transmission that we can use. But there's a part, how can we enhance it? And that's root cause analysis. I think a topic close to your heart,
Yep.
close to my heart. How do we get better root cause analysis? How do we get communication of these results? And how do we prevent additional outbreaks and cases happening from the same root cause over and over again? And I think that's where we're really falling short. And I'm worried that it's getting worse. And I'm going to give you an example why I think. I'm worried it's getting worse because, public health workforce, whether it's, CDC, whether it's FDA, whether it's states, get pinched. And the epidemiologists, the people in public health, when the resources get pinched, the first thing that's probably going to go is root cause analysis. Because okay, we found the outbreak, we had a recall, the outbreak stopped, let's move on to finding the next outbreak and stopping it. It's not taking the time to go back saying what actually went wrong and then writing it up in a way where it's useful and making sure it's communicated in a way where we prevent outbreaks. And if we don't fix that, then I think WGS becomes a cool tool, but it's only providing 20% of its benefit because we're not doing the root cause analysis and the communication. And I know you've talked about, and others have talked about the importance of just coming up with better systems for that, but that's similar to what FAA does,
Right.
or other ones. But I think that's, so taking that, yes, whole genome sequence has been impactful. And now how do we amplify that impact to, again, bend the curve to get to the topic of this podcast? I think that's where I'm sitting right now.
No, it's such a good build on it in saying WGS alone in a vacuum and isolation isn't the silver bullet. It's how you use it. And so to your point, it's about WGS informing in a different way. What are vehicles that are causing illnesses, whether the most common vehicles that cause outbreaks or whether they're novel vehicles. And then it also sheds a lot of light on routes of contamination. And then you said, even with WGS, you still need the kind of shoe leather, boots on the ground type of approach, right? And at the state level in particular, and with the resources, Martin, I'm with you, concerned being cut. Can we actually get to root cause investigations, or are we just going to learn the outbreaks happen and we never know really what led to them? So those are all great points. And even I hear you, while I was at the agency, is policies, government policies can incentivize, how we work on listeria and how we use WGS. So that's a great pivot to WGS. And I think you recently wrote a paper on this. There's a couple of seminal papers on WGS. I would recommend that the readers go out and read your paper. I know Dr. Besser at CDC wrote one years ago when WGS was first coming along. But it has a lot of strengths, but you have to use the tool the right way. And I've seen it used in outbreak settings, quite frankly, when I was in the public sector, where people jump to conclusions too quickly, which is it's found in a bag of salad. There might be a resident strain in a plant, and lo and behold, we find out, well, this company had been involved in the same kind of listeria illnesses in the past, same sequence match. But that last one wasn't produced in the same plant. And the company actually did some good root cause, Martin, and determined, hey, it was a harvester. Lettuce coming, so, for one of those incidents from Salinas, the next time from Yuma. What's in common? It's not the same manufacturing plant, but that company was able to find it in the harvester.
That's a great example of what needs to happen more. And yeah, absolutely. In this case, it was the company who did it and actually communicated it, and they did a tremendous job. And I know industries out there, doing more things with harvester sanitation. They took the bull by the horns and really focused in on it. And, it's hard to define and determine how many illnesses we prevented, because I guarantee you there were sporadic illnesses in addition to it. And this is what needs to happen more. I think it's a really great example, Frank.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of what you're saying. And on the other hand, though, we've solved outbreaks where we never were able to obtain a WGS match. And so maybe the question I'll ask you, because we're running out of time, we could go on for hours here. What encouragement or advice do you have to industry? Because while I see, public health has leaned in, I still hear from some companies that I talk to or people in the private sector that I have conversations with, they're fearful, they're concerned that they actually start sequencing pathogens that they find in their plant. it might be incriminating and it might get linked to human illnesses. I know you hear that as well a lot. What advice do you have to the private sector? Because it is a game-changing tool.
It is a game-changing tool, and my advice usually is sort of multiple steps. First of all, just don't let the fear stop you for at least looking further. Try to define what is the risk, how big is the risk, and then what are the benefits. And at the end, I tend to be somewhat business oriented, is what's your return over investment? If your risk is, oh, maybe FDA will do this and maybe, because a lot of it is things that haven't happened, right? Maybe FDA is just going to come in and ask me to turn over all the whole genome sequence. I'm like, yeah, they've asked, and sometimes asked in unfortunate ways that sort of make it sound like they're gonna like punish you if you don't give them. But that's a communication thing. Did they really push it to the end? I don't seem to recall that ever happening. So let's make sure we don't just have sort of, community fear prevent using the right tools. But then on the other hand, we as food safety professionals also need to challenge that. What's the advantage? Okay, we're going to detect an outbreak earlier or an issue earlier. We detect it when it's not on a food contact surface. We know when something is persistent. We can prevent that recall that's going to cost us millions. We can prevent that shutdown. So try to really take a close, hard look at what pros and cons and advantages. And some company will decide to not use it. And I'm okay with that, as long as they took a close, hard look at it and decided, and then reevaluate, right? I think the things are shifting, things are changing, and maybe today it's not the right decision for you for a business. Maybe it is in 10 years. And then if you don't think WGS is the right tool for whatever, right? And sometimes it's other reasons, turnaround time, it's cost, and for some people, it's hard to get WGS in a fast turnaround. I mean, there are people, I think, you can demand faster turnaround time. I think if someone gives you 4 weeks, you just got to push back. That's ridiculous. You should not have 4 weeks. In the US, where you can get easy access, or in Canada, or in some countries, not talking about a plant in the middle of nowhere and who knows where, right? I think that's important. Then maybe you say, okay, we're not going to use WGS. What other tools do we have? Can we do some subtyping that's not as sensitive, but still help us make some of those decisions better and faster and get some of the advantages, but not the full advantages of subtyping. And then, as I said, reevaluate. And I think there's going to become a time where it's like it's worse to not use it than use it. Just at the beginning, everything has certain risk, but let's quantify the risk and not just. I think that's actually people think they see WGS as a hazard and they're not really evaluating the risk it truly bases.
Right.
Let's apply those same principles to that. I mean,
That's
would be my
good.
advice. And usually when we walk through it with people, I think people at the end of the day come away that many of them will use WGS and some of them will use other tools. And someone will say, well, we'll sit on the sidelines for a little bit longer. But hey.
I like the analogy of thinking about it as a hazard and a risk, which is if you think it through, if you think you're in a facility, Martin, we don't have time to go into legacy facilities. We have a lot of older facilities. I know you and I are passionate about that. But if you think you're in a facility where you really need to understand what's happening in your environment, right? And you do. Most food producers need to. Are you better off not knowing, or are you better off actually knowing through using WGS or some other form of molecular subtyping tool so that you know how the pathogen might move in your establishment, where it's coming from, and control it? So that's good advice. We could actually, you could probably teach a whole semester on rethinking food safety. I know that's an area that I've spent a lot of time on. It's probably a little bit challenging, but we've built this podcast as a call to action. I've always said, Martin, if people tune in just to satisfy their intellectual curiosity, that's good. It's interesting guests like you. But I really want it to be a call to action. I want them to obtain information to say, maybe I need to think differently, and more importantly, to think differently, do differently. On this whole theme of rethinking, you've given us a lot to think about, difference versus hazards versus risks, doing that well, environmental monitoring versus environmental control. You've talked about, government policies, how you use WGS. You've talked about the importance of getting root cause, all great concepts that we need to continue to think and evolve. But if I close with just, if you had to give the audience, even if it's just kind of doubling down on what you've said earlier, 3 to 5 tips on really spend some time rethinking on this, because if you think we're going to get to the year 2030 or 2035 doing food safety the way we did the past 20 years, I think many companies lose. So what for your top 3 to 5 tips on things people should be thinking or spending some time on?
I think the first very practical thing that everyone can do is intervene. Go back to your facilities, to your programs, reevaluate your prerequisite program and say, do I have true validation that these programs are controlling or minimizing the risk to the extent possible? And then verifying consistent implementation. And for some people, that means to review what validation and verification means. I think we see a lot of verification, which is just making sure something's implemented consistently, but we verify it's something that we don't know whether it's working, but we're consistently doing something that's not working, but at least we're consistent about it. That's the wrong one. So validation and verification of prerequisite programs. Go figure out which ones are critical to preventing foodborne illness, and it's going to be cleaning and sanitation. It's going to be master sanitation schedule. It's going to be preventive maintenance. It's going to be sanitary equipment design. Make sure you got these buckled down. And that's a year project for some companies.
Yep.
That's number one, very tangible. It's going to reduce your risk tremendously. It's going to make your recall smaller if you have one. It's going to reduce the risk of an outbreak, etc. So that's number one. Number two, change management. Topic we didn't bring up. We're changing constantly in food production, sometimes knowingly, put in a new piece of equipment, put in a new floor, bring in new ingredients, make a new product. Sometimes we don't realize that a change is happening, right? We got tariffs, we got an ingredient that we thought is coming from the same facility. It's not. Making sure you know what changes are happening and evaluating their impact on food safety and your food safety systems. I am worried about global instability. I'm worried about tariffs going here, there, everywhere, that impacts trade, where we getting products in and we see in change where we didn't even realize something is changing. So I think that's going to be really important to focus on that, because that's a blind spot. And you and I both know foreign supply verification, number one reason for 483 is, if I'm not mistaken. And I think we've seen it with Moringa. We've seen it with the cerealite issue in Europe, that these foreign suppliers are a challenge, and often that's related to changes that are happening. So change management is number two. Number three is, what we talked about, focus on the risks. Don't get distracted by hazards. I think that laser focus is important, and it requires, and that's important for industry, but I think that's where I'm also going to hold government agencies a little bit, their feet to the fire. They need to make sure what they're doing is risk-based, and that their inspection force on the ground and their investigators on the ground don't inadvertently send messages where they, like I said, focus someone on a listeria positive on a loading dock when there are, which is a hazard, presence of a hazard, don't get me wrong, when there are other much bigger risks.
Yes.
The proverbial, foreign suppliers with negative COAs, which we know we often can't trust. So true risk focused.
It's great.
And then the fourth one, and I'm going to throw it out because I think it's important, but I think you might also have an opinion, is food safety culture is important. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking to the guy who wrote the book. But
there's a but coming.
Of course there's a but coming, Frank. The but is, let's not neglect technical skills, right?
Amen.
And I think some of the issues we've seen in the past, whether it's, Clostridium botulinum, Bacillus cereulite contamination, it does require those technical skills. Let's find that right balance and make sure that we still maintain the technical skills. Food safety still is a technical discipline. It requires both.
Yeah, that's great. No, I don't take offense to that, Martin. In fact, sometimes people ask me, well, you wrote the first book on it, Janos. How do you feel? It's like at every conference now, people are just talking about food safety culture. And I'll be candid with you. I say I have mixed emotions. On the one hand, I'm happy it's an important concept, but on the other hand, I think people have missed the boat, kind of like the seek and destroy comment you made, which is it's bubblegum, pom-poms, rah-rah food safety culture without knowing that you got to know the science, and so it's the food science, it's microbiological science. Behavioral science concepts are important in terms of getting organizations committed, and if you're relying on administrative controls that trying to influence human behavior, you can design training that's more effective. But you're right. I think we're at the point Martin, where it's kind of jumped the shark and it's a little bit too much pom-pom bubblegum food safety culture. And that's not what I intended from the beginning, kind of maybe the way John Butts intended to seek and destroy. I also, when I wanted to have you on this podcast, I said, well, Martin will come on. Knowing Martin, he's not going to spin. A lot of time people will spin and say, well, we have the safest food system in the world, and these recalls are a sign that the system are working. So Martin's going to give us kind of straight talk consistent with this. And now I get to say, during my 4th episode, you're the first one that managed to drop an F-bomb, which I appreciate, which is now, people think, hey, it's kind of the Joe Rogan style food safety podcast. But Martin, we appreciate your kind of straight shooting, fact-based, science-oriented type of response. The information you've provided to our listeners, I think, is invaluable, folks. If you just, take notes of what Martin suggested. He's been doing this a long time. I've trusted and relied on him from the early days of my career in the private sector and when I was at FDA. I just nothing but admiration on the hard science work he's done, and he and his students and his research in advanced food safety. Martin, thank you for all that you've done, that you continue to do, the research. Thank you for the teaching. You're developing the next generation of food safety scientists. Thank you for the continued work that you do in terms of outreach. I know you're still involved quite a bit getting in food plants and working not only preventative type approaches, but in reactive approaches. What a pleasure and honor to get to spend some time with you.
Well, thank you, Frank. Thanks for your kind word. And back to you. Thanks for everything you've done for food safety.
Okay, stay safe. We'll talk again.
Sounds good. Thanks. Okay, bye-bye.
All right, that's a wrap for today. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion as much as I did and found it useful. The next episode is already in queue, and it's yet again another good one, I promise you. It's one that you're not going to want to miss. If you haven't already, please subscribe now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and join these important conversations. As I've said before, together we're going to learn from one another and help create a safer, smarter food system that benefits food producers, regulators, but most importantly, and don't forget that, most importantly, all of our bosses, the consumer. So stay tuned, we'll talk soon, and until then, be safe.